fully complied with. When Director Patel came to the committee, he admitted that up to 1,000 FBI agents had gone through the files and redacted President Trump's name from them. And it's pretty clear that what has been transmitted from the FBI continues to redact President Trump's name, even though he is mentioned thousands of times in these files.
I find it interesting that she keeps going after President Trump, the greatest president in American history. And if they could maintain their composure, this isn't a circus, this is a hearing. I find it interesting she keeps going after Donald Trump. She doesn't say how much money she took from Reid Hoffman, did you?
None.
And nor did
Mr.
she
Chairman,
post
regular
anything.
order, please.
She
regular
posted
order.
nothing on her X account, on her Twitter account, during the Biden years.
Gentlelady.
And yet now,
there
all
was
of
no
a sudden,
question
she's
asked.
going after
Committee will be in
order. There was no question
will be in
asked of
order.
the Attorney General. She doesn't just get to
Committee will be in order.
I have a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Committee will be in order.
February 11th, 2026, did not begin as a spectacle. It began as another long, grinding oversight hearing inside the House Judiciary Committee, the kind that drags on for hours while cameras hum and staffers shuffle paper like nothing historic is happening. Attorney General Pam Bondi had already been sitting under the bright lights for most of the day, fielding questions about the Epstein files, redactions, charging decisions, and the credibility of the Department of Justice. Democrats had pressed her, Republicans had defended her, and Bondi had deflected nearly every substantive question that came her way. By the time Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren's name was recognized, the air in that room was thick with frustration. Survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking ring sat in the gallery, silent, watching the government debate whether the full truth would ever surface. Members of Congress flipped through binders, some exhausted, some irritated, some waiting for their moment. Lofgren did not grandstand. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform outrage. She came armed with documents. Let's be clear about who Zoe Lofgren is. She represents California's 18th District. She has served in Congress since 1995. Before that, she practiced immigration law and taught as a law professor. She is not a cable news flamethrower. She is not known for viral theatrics. She is methodical, procedural, precise. When Lofgren asks a question, it is usually because she already knows exactly what the answer should be. On that day, she had 2 emails. That was it. 2 emails pulled from the Epstein files that the Department of Justice claimed it had exhaustively reviewed. 2 emails that directly involved Jeffrey Epstein and New York Giants owner Steve Tisch. 2 emails that raised a question so basic, so legally straightforward, that any first-year prosecutor would recognize it immediately. Lofgren began not with accusation, but with acknowledgement. She recognized the Epstein survivors sitting behind her. She framed her remarks around transparency and public accountability. She said that out of respect for the American public and the survivors present, the committee owed them a transparent conversation. That was not rhetoric. That was a warning shot. She was signaling that what she was about to present was not speculative. It was documentary. She directed attention to the first email. An individual had written to Jeffrey Epstein asking whether a woman identified as M was pro or civilian. Epstein replied that she was a civilian Russian and fun. Those words matter. Pro or civilian. That is not language used in polite social correspondence. That is coded language in the world of transactional exploitation. It suggests categorization. It suggests commodification. It suggests that someone is being discussed not as a person, but as inventory. Then Lofgren moved to the second email. This one was more direct. Epstein wrote to Steve Tisch about a Ukrainian girl. According to the email, there were concerns about an age difference. Epstein wrote that he would convince her not to return to Ukraine. Then he instructed Tisch to call him, adding the sentence that should have frozen the entire hearing room. I don't like records of these conversations. Read that again. I don't like records of these conversations. That is not ambiguous. That is not casual. That is not harmless. That is someone explicitly acknowledging that certain discussions should not be documented. That is someone who understands that a written trail is dangerous. That is someone attempting to move sensitive communication off the record. Lofgren did not accuse Steve Tisch of a crime. She did not declare guilt. She did not demand indictment. She asked a single, surgical question. Do these emails constitute credible evidence, not proof, but credible evidence warranting further investigation into whether Steve Tisch was involved in Epstein's criminal conduct, yes or no? That was the question. That was the entire point. Notice the discipline in that framing. She did not ask whether Tisch should be prosecuted. She did not ask whether he was guilty. She asked whether the content of those emails rose to the level of credible evidence warranting investigation. In any functioning justice system, that is the baseline threshold. Credible evidence does not equal conviction. It equals inquiry. It equals follow-up. It equals due diligence. Pam Bondi did not say yes. She did not say no. She said she was not going to play a yes or no game. She said she would answer to the best of her ability. She claimed she was not familiar with that specific email and reminded the committee that there were 3 million pages of documents. She assured the room that any case involving any victim would be looked at. But she never answered the question. This is where oversight lives or dies. Congress is not asking for poetry. It is asking for clarity. Does the content of these emails constitute credible evidence warranting further investigation? Yes or no? Bondi chose neither. She chose deflection. She chose delay. She chose to speak long enough to eat into Lofgren's limited 5-minute questioning window. Lofgren tried to push back, reminding the Attorney General that she had only 5 minutes. Bondi kept speaking. The documents have been released. There were 3 million pages. Members could come review them. The redacted versions were available. The implication was that transparency had already been provided. Lofgren cut her off, not rudely, but firmly. She repeated that she had limited time. Bondi continued until she claimed that only 30 seconds remained because of what she characterized as Lofgren's filibuster. The exchange was tense, but not chaotic. It was clinical. One side asking for a yes or no answer about credible evidence. The other side refusing to give one. Lofgren then moved to something even more explosive. She referenced testimony from Director Patel in the same committee room. Patel had stated that there was no credible information indicating that Epstein trafficked victims to anyone else. But the emails in Lofgren's hands suggested otherwise. Epstein was discussing individuals with Steve Tisch. He was categorizing women. He was expressing concern about age differences. He was instructing that conversations move off the written record. That is involvement. That is coordination. That is at minimum material that demands scrutiny. Either Patel's testimony was inaccurate, or the Department of Justice had not fully grappled with what was in its own files. Lofgren reminded the room that in July, the DOJ had issued a memo stating it had conducted an exhaustive review of the Epstein files and concluded that no additional individuals would be charged. Exhaustive review. No additional charges. Those words are heavy. They imply completeness. They imply finality. They imply that nothing further exists to justify action. Then Lofgren did something that cut through the abstraction. She explained that she had personally gone to the Department of Justice to review the files. There are 435 members of the House. There are 4 computers available for review. Do the math. It would take months, possibly longer, for every member to meaningfully examine the material. She called the transparency argument what it was, a sham. In just a few hours of limited access, she saw documentation from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York indicating additional survivors and probable co-conspirators. Probable co-conspirators. That phrase alone contradicts the idea that there was no credible information tying Epstein to others. Other members of Congress had also uncovered likely co-conspirators whose names had been blocked out. The DOJ claimed an exhaustive review and no further charges. Members of Congress, under constrained conditions, found evidence suggesting additional individuals and additional victims. That is not a minor discrepancy. That is a credibility crisis. And that crisis was unfolding in real time, on camera, in front of survivors who had already waited years for accountability. Lofgren pointed to the Epstein Files Transparency Act, passed by all but one member of the House and signed by the President. It required the department to release everything except what needed to be redacted to protect victims or ongoing prosecutions. According to testimony received, there was no ongoing prosecution, yet redactions persisted, names were blocked, access was limited. Then came another revelation. When Director Patel appeared before the committee, he admitted that up to 1,000 FBI agents had gone through the files and redacted President Trump's name from them. 1,000 agents. Not one. Not a small team. 1,000. And Trump's name appeared thousands of times in the files. That is not routine redaction. That is mobilization. That is institutional effort directed toward scrubbing a specific name. And it stood in stark contrast to the claim that the department had conducted an objective, exhaustive review. Lofgren's conclusion was simple. The credibility of the department had been damaged, not just by redactions, by conduct. She then shifted to another issue, referencing a horrific video involving American citizens killed by ICE agents in Minneapolis. State and local police had obtained a court order to access the crime scene to preserve evidence. Federal agents defied that order. In a departure from general policy, the DOJ was not collaborating with local law enforcement on those homicides. Lofgren called that approach disgraceful. She yielded her time. And at that moment, Bondi asked to respond. Not to the emails, not to the contradiction with Patel, not to the 1,000 agents redacting Trump's name, not to the ICE killings. She opened with praise for Donald Trump, calling him the greatest president in American history. And she attacked Lofgren personally. That was the pivot. That was the moment the oversight hearing turned into something else. Pam Bondi did not begin her rebuttal by clarifying the legal threshold for investigation. She did not begin by explaining why those emails failed to meet even the minimal standard of credible evidence. She did not dispute the wording in the messages. She did not challenge their authenticity. Instead, she pivoted immediately to loyalty. She said she found it interesting that Congresswoman Lofgren kept going after President Trump, whom she described as the greatest president in American history. That was her opening frame. Not evidence, not law, not victims. The greatest president in American history, in a hearing about the Epstein files, in a hearing about redactions, in a hearing about whether credible evidence warranted investigation. That statement alone shifted the tone of the room. It signaled that this was no longer a legal exchange. It was political territory. Bondi went further. She accused Lofgren of taking money from Reid Hoffman, a Democratic donor. She suggested partisan motivation. She implied hypocrisy. She referenced Lofgren's social media activity during the Biden years. None of that addressed the emails. None of that answered the yes or no question. None of that touched the legal threshold Lofgren had carefully drawn. It was personal. It was partisan. It was deflection in its purest form. Lofgren attempted to invoke a point of order. She stated plainly that the witness, without responding to the question, had attacked her personally. The chairman pushed back, but Lofgren made her final assessment unmistakably clear. She said it was pathetic that the Attorney General could not answer the question and instead resorted to attacks. Pathetic. That word hung in the air. This was not a shouting match. It was a procedural unraveling. One elected official presenting documentary evidence and asking for a threshold determination. The chief law enforcement officer of the United States declining to provide it and instead offering political praise and personal accusation. That contrast was the story. Let's slow this down. Lofgren did not demand charges against Steve Tisch. She did not assert criminal liability. She asked whether the content of those emails constituted credible evidence warranting investigation. That is a prosecutorial baseline. When a federal prosecutor receives documentary evidence that includes references to age concerns, cross-border movement, and explicit attempts to avoid written records, the standard response is not silence. It is inquiry. Credible evidence does not require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It does not require certainty. It requires enough substance to justify looking deeper. The emails contain discussions about a Ukrainian girl, concerns about age difference, and a directive to move communications off the record. In any other context, those elements would at least trigger a preliminary review. Bondi claimed unfamiliarity with the specific email. She cited the volume of documents, 3 million pages. That number is intended to overwhelm. It is meant to imply that no single detail can reasonably be expected to be known. But the Department of Justice issued a memo stating it had conducted an exhaustive review. Exhaustive means comprehensive. Exhaustive means you know what is in the file. If the review was truly exhaustive, the Attorney General should not be unfamiliar with high-profile emails involving a billionaire connected to Epstein. If she is unfamiliar, then either the review was not exhaustive, or the review did not flag what any reasonable observer would flag. Both possibilities undermine the credibility of the department. Director Patel's prior testimony compounds the problem. He told the committee there was no credible information indicating that Epstein trafficked victims to anyone else. No credible information. That is a categorical statement. It is not nuanced. It is not hedged. It is definitive. The emails Lofgren presented suggest communication between Epstein and another individual discussing women in transactional language, raising age concerns, and moving sensitive conversations off the written record. That is information. Whether it ultimately supports charges is a separate question. But to claim there is no credible information is to erase those communications entirely. This is not about political party. This is about institutional consistency. The Department of Justice told the American people it had performed an exhaustive review. It told Congress no additional individuals would be charged. It testified that there was no credible information tying Epstein to others. And then, in open session, a member of Congress produced documents suggesting otherwise. Transparency was the promise. The Epstein Files Transparency Act required the department to release everything except material necessary to protect victims or ongoing prosecutions. According to testimony in that same room, there were no ongoing prosecutions. Yet names were redacted. Access was limited. Access. And Trump's name, according to Patel, had been scrubbed thousands of times by up to 1,000 FBI agents. That number deserves attention. 1,000 agents assigned to redaction. That is not routine administrative work. That is a coordinated institutional effort. It reflects prioritization. It reflects resource allocation. It reflects intent. And it directly intersects with the credibility question Lofgren was raising. If the department mobilized massive resources to redact one name while claiming exhaustive objectivity, that raises legitimate oversight concerns. Lofgren was not speculating. She was referencing testimony from Patel himself. The implication was not subtle. The implication was that political sensitivity influenced how the files were handled. Then there was the access issue. 4 computers for 435 members of Congress. That is not practical transparency. That is procedural obstruction disguised as compliance. Lofgren called it a sham because in practical terms, it functioned as one. Lawmakers cannot meaningfully review millions of pages under such constraints. Despite those limits, she and others found references to additional survivors and probable co-conspirators. Probable co-conspirators is not a casual phrase. It appears in investigative summaries when evidence suggests collaborative wrongdoing. If those references existed in the files, then the assertion of no additional individuals warranting charges becomes harder to defend. This is where institutional trust fractures. Oversight is designed to test executive branch assertions. When executive testimony conflicts with documentary evidence, Congress has a duty to press further. Lofgren did exactly that. She presented evidence. She asked for a threshold determination. She did not receive one. Bondi's decision to pivot to personal attacks signals something deeper than irritation. It signals defensive posture. Instead of reinforcing the department's analytical conclusions with legal reasoning, she framed the exchange as partisan hostility toward President Trump. That reframing is strategic. It shifts the audience from evaluating evidence to evaluating motives. But motives do not erase documents. Campaign donations do not nullify email content. Social media silence during a previous administration does not alter the language, "I don't like records of these conversations." That sentence stands on its own. It does not require partisan interpretation. It requires institutional seriousness. The survivors in the gallery were not watching a political feud. They were watching whether the government would apply consistent standards. They were watching whether credible evidence would trigger credible inquiry. They were watching whether the department charged with enforcing federal law would prioritize accountability over allegiance. When Bondi chose to praise Trump and question Lofgren's funding rather than answer yes or no, she made that choice in full view of the public record. She made it knowing cameras were rolling. She made it after hours of testimony where Democrats had pressed on redactions and charging decisions. It was not an accident. It was a decision. And decisions at that level matter. The Attorney General is not a campaign surrogate. The Attorney General is not a cable commentator. The Attorney General is the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States. When presented with documentary evidence suggesting potential involvement of a powerful individual in proximity to Epstein's criminal conduct, the standard response should be clarity. Instead, the hearing revealed ambiguity. It revealed tension between stated conclusions and documented communications. It revealed a department that claimed exhaustive review while simultaneously citing unfamiliarity with specific evidence. It revealed redaction practices that disproportionately shielded certain names. And it revealed an attorney general who chose political framing over legal precision. This is not about whether Steve Tisch is guilty. It is about whether the threshold for investigation was met. It is about whether the Department of Justice applies the same standards to billionaires that it applies to ordinary citizens. It is about whether exhaustive review means what it says. Zoe Lofgren asked one question. Do these emails constitute credible evidence warranting further investigation? Yes or no? Pam Bondi declined to answer. That refusal now lives in the public record. And the consequences of that refusal extend far beyond a single hearing. What makes this moment consequential is not volume. It is structure. The structure of oversight depends on a simple exchange. Congress presents evidence. The executive branch responds with clarity. When that structure collapses, accountability weakens. And on February 11th, 2026, that structure bent in full view of the American public. Let's return to the emails themselves. Epstein discussing a woman as pro or civilian. Epstein describing her as a civilian Russian and fun. Epstein writing to Steve Tisch about a Ukrainian girl, acknowledging concerns about age difference, stating he would convince her not to return to Ukraine, then instructing Tisch to call him because he did not like records of those conversations. These are not fragments taken out of context. They are complete sentences. They carry intent. Language reveals mindset. The phrase pro or civilian reduces a person to a classification. It implies that the woman's status is being evaluated for transactional purposes. The concern about age difference signals awareness of potential legal or moral risk. The instruction to avoid written records signals consciousness of exposure. These are not random details, they form a pattern. Now, place those words against Director Patel's categorical statement that there was no credible information indicating Epstein trafficked victims to anyone else. No credible information. The emails directly reflect communication with another individual regarding women connected to Epstein's orbit. Whether that ultimately meets the criminal standard for trafficking is separate. But to call it no credible information stretches plausibility. Oversight is not about speculation. It is about reconciling statements with evidence. Lofgren did not accuse the department of fabricating documents. She did not accuse Patel of deliberate deception. She laid the contradiction on the table and allowed it to speak for itself. Either the department's internal review failed to account for these communications, or its public statements overstated their certainty. When the Department of Justice issued its memo claiming an exhaustive review and no additional individuals would be charged, it communicated closure. Closure in a case of this magnitude carries weight. It signals to victims that the investigative chapter is complete. It signals to the public that the system has done its work. Closure must rest on confidence. Yet members of Congress, given limited access and time, located references to additional survivors and probable co-conspirators. Probable co-conspirators is investigative language. It does not equal conviction. It does not equal indictment. But it indicates that the investigative file recognized potential collaborative conduct. That recognition alone contradicts the tone of finality. Transparency under the Epstein Files Transparency Act was supposed to remove doubt. The act required release of everything except material necessary to protect victims or ongoing prosecutions. According to testimony, there were no ongoing prosecutions. But redactions remained. Names were blocked. Access was restricted to 4 computers. 4 computers for 435 members of Congress is not meaningful transparency. It is symbolic compliance. It creates the appearance of openness while functionally limiting review. When Lofgren described it as a sham, she was not engaging in theatrics. She was describing a structural bottleneck. Transparency must be practical to be real. The redaction of President Trump's name introduces another layer. Patel testified that up to 1,000 FBI agents were involved in reviewing and redacting Trump's name from files where it appeared thousands of times. That figure is extraordinary. It demonstrates scale. It demonstrates focus. It demonstrates that certain references received extraordinary institutional attention. Redaction is sometimes necessary. Victim identities must be protected. Sensitive investigative techniques must be shielded. But when one name requires a mobilization of that magnitude, oversight bodies are entitled to ask whether the redaction process was evenly applied. That question does not presume wrongdoing. It demands consistency. Bondi did not address that consistency question directly. She did not explain why 1,000 agents were necessary. She did not contextualize the decision. She shifted to loyalty language. She framed scrutiny of redactions as partisan hostility toward Trump. That reframing may resonate politically, but it does not answer oversight concerns. Then there is the Minneapolis incident Lofgren referenced, a horrific video of American citizens killed by ICE agents. State and local police obtained a court order to access the crime scene to preserve evidence. Federal agents defied that order. The Department of Justice did not collaborate with local law enforcement in the aftermath. That conduct, if accurately described, raises serious federalism and accountability questions. Lofgren's criticism was direct. She said the approach was disgraceful and did nothing to bring credit to the department. That statement was not rhetorical flourish. It was tied to the larger credibility theme. When the same department faces questions about transparency in the Epstein files, and about cooperation in a domestic homicide investigation, patterns begin to form. Institutional credibility is cumulative. It is built over time and eroded by inconsistency. The refusal to answer a yes or no question about credible evidence does not exist in isolation. It sits alongside redaction controversies, access limitations, testimonial contradictions, and alleged non-compliance with court orders. Each incident compounds the perception problem. What makes Lofgren's exchange potent is its restraint. She did not shout. She did not insult. She did not engage in personal attacks until after Bondi pivoted to attacking her. Her approach was documentary. Present the emails. Ask the threshold question. Reference the prior testimony. Cite the memo. Describe the access limitations. That methodical approach makes the refusal more conspicuous. If she had delivered an inflammatory speech, the refusal might blend into partisan noise. But she did not. She asked a prosecutor's question. Does this meet the credible evidence threshold? That question echoes beyond the hearing room. Because credible evidence is not a partisan concept. It is the foundation of investigation. If that threshold is not met here, the department should be able to articulate why. If it is met, the department should acknowledge that further review is appropriate. Silence creates suspicion. Deflection amplifies it. The survivors watching that hearing have already endured a justice system that failed them once. Epstein's first federal plea deal remains a stain on institutional memory. When the government promises transparency and exhaustive review, it must deliver clarity. Anything less invites comparison to past failures. Pam Bondi's role in that moment was pivotal. As Attorney General, she represents the credibility of the department. Her refusal to answer did not erase the emails. It did not negate the documentary record. It introduced doubt about how that record was evaluated. Oversight hearings are often dismissed as theater, but sometimes theater reveals substance. In this case, the substance was a simple question and a conspicuous non-answer. That non-answer now joins the official transcript. It will be cited. It will be analyzed. It will be revisited. Zoe Lofgren exposed a fracture between documentary evidence and executive assertion, between claims of exhaustive review and findings of probable co-conspirators, between promises of transparency and functional limitations on access. That fracture cannot be patched with praise for a president or accusations about campaign donations. At its core, this was about whether the Department of Justice is willing to apply the same investigative lens to powerful individuals that it applies to everyone else. It was about whether words like exhaustive and credible retain their ordinary meaning. It was about whether oversight can still compel clarity. The American public does not require conviction to demand inquiry. It requires confidence that inquiry is not selectively avoided. When an attorney general declines to say yes or no about credible evidence warranting investigation, the public hears something louder than silence. It hears hesitation. And hesitation in matters of accountability reverberates. Hesitation at the top of the Department of Justice is not a small thing. It signals uncertainty where there should be precision. It signals caution where there should be confidence. And in a case shadowed by years of institutional failure, hesitation does not calm the public. It unsettles it. The Epstein files are not an abstract controversy. They represent documented abuse, trafficking, and exploitation that spanned borders and years. Survivors sat in that hearing room because the system once failed to protect them. When Congress passes a Transparency Act and the Department of Justice claims an exhaustive review, expectations rise accordingly. Zoe Lofgren understood that. That is why she framed her question with discipline. She did not attempt to litigate guilt from the dais. She did not pronounce judgment. She asked whether documentary evidence met the threshold for investigation. That is the starting line of accountability, not the finish line. Pam Bondi's refusal to cross that starting line matters. It matters because it places the department's credibility at the center of the story rather than the substance of the emails. It matters because it reinforces the perception that proximity to power complicates investigative clarity. It matters because the American public has heard similar assurances before. When the Department of Justice says no additional individuals will be charged after an exhaustive review, it is closing a door. When members of Congress later point to probable co-conspirators and contradictory communications, that door no longer looks securely shut. It looks questioned. And when the Attorney General declines to say whether those communications warrant investigation, the hinge creaks louder. The emails themselves remain in the public record. Epstein discussing classification of a woman as pro or civilian. Epstein acknowledging age difference concerns. Epstein writing that he would convince a Ukrainian girl not to return home. Epstein instructing Steve Tisch to call him because he did not like records of those conversations. Those are facts on paper. In criminal law, consciousness of guilt is often inferred from attempts to conceal. Moving conversations off written record is not definitive proof of wrongdoing, but it is relevant. It is the kind of detail investigators note. It is the kind of language that justifies further inquiry. That is why Lofgren's question was so narrow and so powerful. If credible evidence exists, investigation follows. If it does not, explanation follows. Bondi chose neither clarity nor explanation. She chose to recast the moment as partisan warfare. That may energize political allies, but it does not resolve institutional tension. Director Patel's testimony about no credible information and about 1,000 agents redacting President Trump's name now sits alongside the exchange. Those statements are no longer isolated. They form part of a pattern the public can examine. Redaction decisions, access limitations, and categorical assurances are now intertwined. 4 computers for 435 members of Congress remains a stark image. It embodies procedural compliance without substantive openness. When Lofgren described the transparency argument as a sham, she was not dismissing the law. She was challenging the implementation. Transparency that cannot be meaningfully accessed does not rebuild trust. The Minneapolis incident Lofgren referenced also lingers. Federal agents defying a court order. The Department of Justice not collaborating with local law enforcement on homicides involving American citizens. Whether every detail withstands scrutiny or not, the perception of non-cooperation compounds credibility concerns. Institutional trust is fragile. It is strengthened when officials answer hard questions directly. It is weakened when those questions are reframed as partisan attacks. Bondi had an opportunity to reinforce the department's analytical process. She could have said the emails had been reviewed, explained the legal analysis, and justified the conclusion. She did not. Instead, the public saw an attorney general praise a president and question a congresswoman's funding sources. That choice reframed the hearing from evidence evaluation to loyalty affirmation. In a case as sensitive as Epstein's, that reframing is combustible. The survivors who watched that exchange did not hear a legal explanation. They heard avoidance. They saw a question about credible evidence redirected toward political allegiance. For people who have already experienced institutional betrayal, that redirection carries weight. Zoe Lofgren's final word in that exchange was that it was pathetic not to answer the question. That word was not polite. It was not diplomatic. It reflected frustration. But it also reflected something deeper. It reflected the collapse of a basic oversight expectation. The Attorney General of the United States is entrusted with enforcing federal law impartially. When confronted with documentary evidence involving a billionaire and a notorious trafficker, impartiality must be visible. It must be audible. It must be unmistakable. Anything less invites suspicion. The Steve Tisch emails are now etched into the Congressional record. The refusal to provide a yes or no answer is etched beside them. Director Patel's prior testimony is etched nearby. The memo claiming exhaustive review and no additional charges stands in parallel. These elements together create a narrative that will not disappear. This is not the end of the story. Oversight does not conclude with a single hearing. It continues through follow-up letters, document requests, additional testimony, and public pressure. The refusal to answer may generate more questions rather than fewer. What Zoe Lofgren exposed was not proof of guilt. She exposed a tension between documentary evidence and institutional posture. She exposed the fragility of claims of exhaustive review when confronted with specific communications. She exposed the vulnerability of transparency arguments when access is constrained. Pam Bondi's decision in that moment defined the tone of the department's defense. It was not technical. It was political. It did not reassure skeptics. It did not extinguish doubt. It preserved ambiguity. The American people deserve clarity when it comes to the Epstein files. They deserve confidence that credible evidence triggers credible investigation, regardless of wealth or proximity to power. They deserve assurance that redactions are applied evenly and not selectively. They deserve a Department of Justice that answers yes or no questions with yes or no. On February 11, 2026, that clarity was not delivered. Instead, a narrow oversight question became a referendum on institutional credibility. The hearing ended, but the implications did not. The emails remain. The testimony remains. The refusal remains. History often turns not on dramatic declarations, but on small moments of avoidance. A yes or no question unanswered. A document acknowledged but unexplained. A claim of exhaustive review challenged by specific evidence. These are the fault lines along which trust shifts. Zoe Lofgren asked whether the emails constituted credible evidence warranting further investigation. Pam Bondi declined to answer. That exchange now stands as a marker. It marks the point where transparency met resistance, where oversight met deflection, and where the credibility of the Department of Justice was publicly tested.